Photographers have several ways of being creative. One of my most enjoyable ways of being creative is developing the studio that we have here at Collins & Associates, which is a studio designed to help interns and young photographers come in, understand the foundation, not so much by schooling, but by applying, by working within an environment and developing a strong craft and understanding the science of photography. Tim Montoani probably has learned better than anybody I've ever seen in this world. He's worked real hard at it, he's studied, he's been very disciplined, and he's slowly but surely developed himself into not only a very solid photographer, but a very creative photographer.
Tim Montoani's brief photographic career has been filled with many highlights thus far. After graduating from Brooks Institute and winning the Lexus Car and Driver Student Shootout, he immediately joined the studio of photographer-educator Dean Collins and began working with Dean. The past few years have brought Tim his own clientele, and he is quickly becoming a major player in the photographic world. Yet the Collins influence is evident only in Montoani's technical expertise. His portrait style is distinctive and very powerful. Many of Tim's most successful portraits have been created with large format cameras. But it isn't only the quality of a 4x5 image that is important to this young photographer.
I started using large format for several reasons. One, the quality obviously is going to be a lot better. And two, for someone my age, new in this business, I'm dealing with athletes that are photographed all the time. When I come in with a 35mm camera, they look at me and go, here's another kid with a camera, you know, take a picture and get out of here. But when I set up a CNR P2, a couple different light boxes, brawn packs, have assistants running around, they say, hey, this guy means business. And typically they're going to give me a little extra time that they wouldn't give another photographer, and it really forces me to direct the shoot and make the photograph rather than take the photograph. Shooting large format, you tell that guy, stand there and don't move unless I tell you, otherwise you don't get the shot.
This first image of world champion boxer Jesse James Leha uses the boxer's shiny title belt as a light source for the subject's eyes and face. James Leha arrives in the morning for this shoot for No Fear clothing. It is Tim Montoani's plan to use the boxer's championship belt in the photograph.
So what I want to do is I want to do a really tight shot of your face. I'm going to light just the belt with a real spotlight so that this will be the light source, and it'll be so close that hopefully in your eyes will be lit, you'll see the belt. So let's try it.
The main light source for this image is a Broncolor Primo Series strobe head with a reflector. With a strobe attached to a long boom arm, Montoani sets the light source directly over the subject's head. He then works with Leha to position the reflective belt. Using the belt as the main light source for the boxer's face, Montoani sets the belt and Leha into position. The camera is then moved into place. For this image, Tim will use a CNR P2 4x5 camera with a 300mm lens. An additional standard bellows was added to the camera to allow focus at this close distance. A meter reading is taken to establish a proper exposure for the subject's face. Montoani faces the dome of the Broncolor incident meter toward the reflective belt to ensure a proper reading. Subtracting the reduction of light for the long bellows extension, the camera is set at f32. When focusing a large format camera at a subject which is close to the camera, you must extend the bellows to enable the image to be focused on the camera's ground glass. As the bellows is extended, light passing through the lens must travel a greater distance, creating a change in exposure. To compensate for this light loss, you must either increase the amount of light striking your subject, decrease your shutter speed, or open your camera's aperture. With the framing set, a Polaroid film holder is slipped into the camera and the first image is recorded.
Staring right in that lens. 1, 2, and 3. Relax. It's just a Polaroid. We'll take a look at it and then do the real deal.
The exposure on the first Polaroid is perfect, and Tim shares the idea and the image with Leha. Montoani feels it is important to involve the subject of a portrait with the concept of the photograph. With the exposure and framing set, Tim works to reset the subject and the belt. Because of the position that Leha must hold, Montoani works quickly to prepare for film. Critical focus is checked with a loop on the ground glass of the camera.
Make sure your eyes are nice and sharp. That's what we want. Perfect, right there. Okay, here we go. Film.
The image is set, and the camera is loaded with Kodak EPP Ektachrome 100 Plus as Montoani begins to put this dramatic portrait of a boxer onto film. With only 90 minutes to complete a day's shooting, Montoani and his crew work quickly to complete the shot. A look at the final image reveals that by placing the light source directly over the subject's head, the look of two sources was achieved. There is top light on Leja's head and shoulders, and the reflection of light from the belt serves as a key light source for both his face and eyes. By looking at the overall exposure of the image, we can see that the face was properly exposed at f32, and the head and shoulders of Leja are slightly overexposed at a reading of f45.5.
With a portrait, the eyes control the photograph. Whether they're lit or not lit, each have an effect. In many cases, I'm lighting the subject matter from below and creating steel catch lights in the eyes from below, so-called monster light, which is appropriate for these guys that I'm photographing. It wouldn't be for a traditional family portrait. With the case of James Leja, I lit him with a spot over his shoulder, lighting his championship belt, which acted as the main source, bouncing the light back into his face, and the effect is that the catch light in his eyes is a reflection of his world championship belt. Once you understand the relationship between your main light source and the specular of your eyes, you can do anything you want with that light. In the case of Ivan Stewart, putting no fear on the light source and making no fear appear in the catch lights in his eyes.
These images are other examples of how Montoani affects the mood of the image with both the placement of the light source and the physical size of the source. Larger, softer sources, placed very close to the subject, create large, soft catch lights in the eyes. Some portraits are more expressive if the eyes are left in darkness. The use of light for this image of James Leja creates a very different mood for a portrait of an athlete. With the subject seated, Montoani will use a medium Chimera light bank with a Primo strobe head as the only light source for this portrait. One might think that placing the source on the floor is rather unorthodox for a portrait, but by using this large diffuse source close to the subject, Montoani is assured that the light quality on Leja will be both soft and dramatic. Chimera light banks are lightweight, portable soft light sources that attach to almost any strobe system. Although the light banks are collapsible, Montoani keeps his set up and hanging from the ceiling when working in the studio. To ensure a proper exposure of the subject, an incident meter reading is taken with the dome of the meter facing the light source. Light loss for the bellows extension is calculated at 1 f-stop, and the camera aperture is set at f11.5. The second bellows used on the previous shot is not needed for this image, and it is removed. Montoani checks focus and framing and prepares to capture a Polaroid.
Good. On three. 1, 2, and 3.
The team goes directly to recording the image on
good.
film.
I want to shoot a
Montoani
50-minute
will shoot
Polaroid
color
with the radio.
transparency and black and white film.
Good, staring right in there. 1, 2, and 3.
The Polaroid is checked for assurance, and the crew then moves on to create the next image. This image of James Leja is a powerful portrait of a tough competitor. By placing the camera below the eye line, the subject seems to tower over us, and the painted canvas background receives only enough illumination to create subtle separation and add interest to the image.
After shooting a pretty conservative portrait on large format, which I'll typically do, pretty straightforward, straight on, I like to put on a wide-angle lens, a 40-50 millimeter on a Hasselblad, get in close, in this case, use the fighter's gloves into the camera and give the viewer a sense of, what it's like to be that close to the subject matter. I think shooting on both medium and large format when these pictures are used at a decent size allows you to study that person's face and really see the detail. A boxer's been hit how many times, and you can see that, if you look at these guys up close, what their face looks like and what it's like to be in the ring.
Wide-angle lenses on a medium format camera can offer an interesting and very different perspective for portraiture. On location, the wide-angle view can help to establish a sense of place or environment. Even in the studio, the wide-angle lens simply offers a different feeling for an image. For these images of James Leja, Montoani uses the wide-angle lens to provide an up-close and personal view of a world champion fighter. As the crew begins to work on the next image, Hasselblad film backs are loaded with Kodak Ektachrome 100, VPS color negative film, and T-Max 100 black and white film. Each film back is labeled to avoid confusion. With the camera light bank still positioned on the floor, Leha is seated once again, this time wearing his black robe. Montoani sets his camera position close to and again below Leha, using a Hasselblad 500 cm body and a 40mm wide-angle lens. The gloves are handed to Leha, and Montoani then begins the work of composing an image. When working with wide-angle lenses up close to the subject, Tim often finds that tilting the camera off-angle can produce a more interesting composition for the portrait. An incident meter reading is then taken with the Braun meter, and the reading is over the maximum aperture of the lens. The output on the power pack is reduced by 1 full stop to achieve a lower f-stop reading. A second reading is taken, and the camera aperture is set at f22 for maximum depth of field. One of the advantages of using the Braun strobe system is that the power packs can be adjusted by 1/10 of an f-stop increments. This allows the photographer to control the output of the strobe to exactly match a particular aperture setting. A Polaroid is taken for assurance, and Montoani begins shooting film immediately. As is typical of Montoani's portrait shoots, the image is recorded on color transparency and color negative, as well as black and white film. As Montoani shoots, he directs Leha to create slightly different expressions and poses. The result is another striking portrait of a boxer. Once again, the image is produced using only a single source of illumination. To create a variation on the wide-angle portrait of Leha, Montoani moves the fighter's gloves up directly between the lens and the subject's face. Once again, using the wide-angle lens will provide the client with a view of James Leha that very few people have ever witnessed. A single Polaroid is shot, and Montoani then moves on to record the image on film. The photograph is another colorful image of Leha, yet this one is more in the traditional style of a boxing portrait. Tim Montoani comments on the idea of mixing strobe and tungsten light in the next and final portrait of the session.
Oftentimes I'll work with a variety of color temperature lights, both strobe and tungsten, using the flash to freeze the subject matter, balance to daylight 5500 degrees. Then in the background use a tungsten light for either anywhere from a 2-second to a 10-second exposure. And burning in that background allows me to move the subject back and forth or move the camera up and down, creating kind of a surreal halo around the subject. Since these guys, most of their life is motion and the action of the sport, I try to incorporate that whenever possible into a portrait.
For this final portrait, the champion dons a stylish jacket and tie, a suggestion made by Leha. The camera light bank is set on a light stand, and Montoani has switched back to the Cinar 4x5 camera. At this point, the light bank is set approximately 6 feet away from the subject, and Montoani decides to thin the source out by turning it vertically. Behind the subject, the base of a grip stand is set close to the painted backdrop, and a 750-watt tungsten Lowell Total light is set on the short stand. The tungsten hot light will illuminate the backdrop with a warm glow of light, and Montoani must determine an exposure for that light. To do this, an incident meter is set on the ambient light setting, and 3 separate readings are taken. Montoani must now determine an exposure that will both capture the main strobe light and the background tungsten light. The meter readings on the background were, from the up, f22.5, 16.3, and 11.4, all at a 1-second exposure. The light bank has been moved in close to the subject, and the meter reading for the subject area from the main strobe is f22. So the exposure is set at f22 with a 1-second shutter speed. The camera is loaded with Polaroid 59. The modeling light is turned off so it does not affect the long exposure, and the image is captured on Polaroid. Montoani is pleased with the results.
This looks great. Perfect. Let's make sure we cover this in color and black and white. Let's shoot like 6 sheets of color, because this is nice.
Back on set, Montoani uses the Polaroid to reposition the title belt in Leha's arms.
Great. Great.
Working once again with a Sinar P2 and a 300mm lens, Montoani checks critical focus with a loop on the ground glass of the camera and begins to put the image on film.
Great, right there, here we go.
One of the reasons that Montoani uses the Sinar P2 4x5 system is its speed and ease of use. The Sinar DB shutter system operates with a fast, self-cocking shutter, and the aperture scale is easy to read and quick to set, even in low light conditions. Focus is constantly checked as the images are put on film.
Same thing, modeling light down, you're holding real still. There we go, on 3, 1, 2, looking right in that lens, 3, good.
The final image of James Leha with his title belt is one of both drama and sophistication. Because of the highly reflective surface of the belt, the use of the large diffuse light source set close to the subject helped to spread the highlight over the surface of the belt and reveal its true textures and tone. An analysis of the exposure shows the background meter readings at f22.5, f16.3, and f11.4 at 1 second. The subject exposure from the strobe was f22. By setting the camera aperture at f22, the subject's skin tone is properly exposed, and the brightest area of the background is well exposed, with the light falling off quickly behind Leha's shoulders. A look at the lighting evolution first reveals the effect of the key light only and no background source, the effect of only the 1 second exposure of the background tungsten light, and the final combination of both strobe and tungsten light. A closer look at Leha's elbow shows the interesting effect of shaking the camera during the long background exposure. Combining tungsten and strobe is a technique that Montoani uses often. This image of wheelchair racer David Bailey was made with a 25-second exposure of a slide projected behind the subject. Football star Darren Carrington was captured with a tungsten light on banana-colored background paper. And this image of trail cyclist Hans Ray was a combination of strobe and a medium format slide projected on a background wall.
One of the things that I feel has enabled me to excel at a young age is my technical background. I had the fortunate experience of working with Dean Collins as his studio manager and first assistant for years. Working with Dean gave me such a strong technical background and understanding of the science of photography, giving me the ability to put what's on my mind onto film. And I would just suggest for any photographer just to have a strong technical background, and that really will enable you to stretch the limits and create any kind of image that you want. I'd have to say that one of the most important things I learned working with Dean Collins is how to standardize my studio to test films to determine the proper ISO for each type of film and every format that I'm shooting. The test that we do involves using a person, so you have a skin tone to look at, ISO cards to determine how you're rating your film for each frame, and a Q14 grayscale. First thing you're going to want to do is load up every type of film that you typically shoot in your studio. In this case, we're going to test VPS, T-Max 100, and Ektachrome 100+. You're going to use an incident light meter to determine your exposure. You're going to put into that meter the recommended ISO of the films that you're testing. The first film we're going to test is Ektachrome 100+. Recommended ISO by Kodak is 100. We put that into our meter, aim the dome of the meter at the main light source, and take 2 meter readings, one at one end of the grayscale and one at the other end, to ensure that the set is evenly lit. The first exposure reading that we got with the dome aimed at the light source is f8 1/3 at 1/60th for 100 ISO. The next thing you're going to do is write out a chart. It's going to show your bracketed exposures from f4 to 11 2/3. Effectively, what we're going to do is rate each frame at a different ISO from 20 to 250. Our starting point in 1/3 stop increments is our incident light meter reading, in this case 8 1/3 at a 60th of a second for 100 ISO film. Each time you adjust your exposure a third of a stop, you're going to replace the ISO card in the frame. This is going to allow you, when the test is completed, to look at your film and determine which ISO you like the best. Keep in mind that there are no third stop indentations on your aperture ring, so you're going to have to just kind of eyeball it in between your exposures. For 4x5 film, we do the same test. However, so we don't have to shoot a sheet of film on each separate ISO, we just developed a cardboard jig which goes in the back of your camera and allows you to only expose a quarter of each sheet of film. What you're going to want to do is put the jig into place and shoot each film that you're testing before you move the jig to the next position for the next ISO. Now that you've completed your test, you're going to run your film normally at your lab. For our first test, for the E6 film, we get our transparency film back and we view it on a light box. We see that some of the frames are underexposed and some of the frames are overexposed. Somewhere in the middle, however, is the frame that looks good, the skin tone looks good, the scale looks good, and we say, okay, that's it. You look into the frame, you see what ISO card is in there, that's the ISO rating for that specific frame, and that's how you're going to start rating your film from now on. Now keep in mind that everybody's test is going to be a little bit different because it's going to depend on your camera gear, your lighting equipment, and most importantly, what you like. Another thing we'll do to determine an effective ISO for both a push and a pull with our E6 film is shoot 2 additional rolls when we're doing our test, run one roll at a +1 stop push and another roll at a -1 stop pull. When that film's processed, you can determine the appropriate ISO as well as the effects of both pushing and pulling your E6 film. With your negative film, you're going to have it processed normally, take it to the lab, and request that they print it at the Shirley or target negative, which is how they calibrate their enlargers every day. If you don't do that, what they're going to do is look at all your exposures, which are all over the place, and try to fix them, making them look all the same. Once your negative film is printed, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to look at either your contact print or your test roll of prints, and you're going to pick out which ISO you like the best. This now becomes the standard printing for everything that you'll send to your lab. You're going to take your negatives to the lab, say printed at the Shirley. You're going to need to look at the back of your test print and look at the filtration at which it was printed and make sure that from now on, when you take your film to your lab, it's printed at that filtration at the Shirley. This now gives you total control of your C41 process. But keep in mind that now you're in charge of not only the exposure being correct, but the filtration and color temperature as well. For your black and white films, you're going to want to do the same test. We shoot 3 rolls. We run 1 roll at normal developing time, 1 roll at -20% of the normal developing time, and 1 at +20%. This gives us an effective ISO for a normal, for a push, and for a pull. To standardize your black and white printing, you're going to make your own Shirley. How you're going to do this is use a clear piece of unexposed film that's going to allow you to have the density minimum, or the base of the film, to print through. You're going to take this negative, put it into the enlarger, and you're going to be printing through it to find out what your standard time for your black and white enlarger is going to be. When you start your printing, you're going to want to select a middle aperture of your enlarger, say f8. With the cleared piece of film in the enlarger, you're going to do a test strip to determine your exposure as you normally would do for a print. A good way to do it is in 3-second intervals, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. Once that paper is processed normally, you're going to examine the paper to find out when the paper first turns black. This is going to allow you to find out what the minimum printing time is for maximum density on the paper from the minimum density of your negative. Now that you have a standard printing time for enlarger, take the cleared piece of film out of the enlarger and contact print each set of your negatives. Again, view over the film, look at what ISO you like the best for both a normal, a push, and also a pull, and now you have a system that you know how to rate your film, process your film, and print your film to get the optimum results every time. If you got all that, you now have a system to develop all of your different types of films and standardize your studio. This isn't an easy process, and keep in mind that if you shoot both inside and outside, you should do the test for both indoor lighting conditions and outdoor lighting conditions because the luminance contrast in both situations is different. However, if you put the time in to do this test, you're going to end up with consistent results every time you shoot those films.
Using your subject's professional working environment can help to tell a story in your portraits. These images make the subject's profession quite clear. But working in the studio can present some limitations for a photographer. For this shoot with world-class track cyclist Marty Nothstein, Montoani stretched the limitations of the studio and combined technical knowledge with artistry to create several very striking images in less than an hour.
Well, I knew, unlike the last time that I've worked with Marty here at the Velodrome, that we were going to be working in the studio, and you know that's good and bad depending on what you're trying to get out of the shoot. Unlike working on location where you have bikes and props and a variety of different things, sometimes working in the studio you're limited to just working with him, making him the center of attention and not using the other components to help the design of your photograph. In this specific situation, I knew that I wanted to use the sky, the blue sky. He's got his red, white, and blue jersey, which symbolizes he is the best in the world, and I want to show him in some kind of an environment, not just against a dark background in the studio. So by just simply opening the back door of the studio, lighting him inside the studio where he's in the shade with a large light source, underexposing the sky a little bit to get that deep saturated blue sky, I can come up with a pretty dynamic portrait that gives a sense of location but gives me the control I want with all the tools I need in my studio right there.
The photographer and client have arrived. Nothstein's crew prepares the bike as the studio roll-up door is opened. For his main light source, Montoani will use a large Chimera light bank with a Broncolor Pulso 4 strobe head. Assistant Jeff Wyant begins to work on the setup for the photograph. As Nothstein dresses for the shot, the light bank and strobe head are carried near the open studio door, and the strobe head is then attached to the top of a light stand. While the trainer applies lotion to Nothstein's legs, the athlete takes in some early morning nutrition. On the opposite side of the studio, Montoani assembles the Hasselblad ELX body with a Polaroid back and a 120mm lens. Film backs are loaded with Kodak EPP and T-Max 100 films. With the Hasselblad mounted onto the rolling stand, Montoani moves his camera into position near the open door. The raised platform is set just inside the shade of the large studio door for the cyclist Nothstein to stand on. Assistant Jeff Wyant steps up onto the platform to take an incident meter reading of the strobe light.
F11 at 125 based on basic daylight exposure, and we want to underexpose that out there by, let's start out with 2/3. So give me a reading at about 11 2/3 f16 at 125.
Danny was looking good.
16 2/3 at
16 at 2/3. Okay, I'm going to drop the power one stop here on the pack. Test. Okay, one more time.
You're 16 at 125.
16 at 125. Okay. That'll be good.
Nothstein is ready, and he climbs up onto the platform with his bike. Working with an exposure for the sky of a 1/25 at f11, Montoani has adjusted the strobe to produce an output equal to a 1/25 at f16. Setting the camera at f16 provides a proper exposure for the subject area and underexposes the sky by 1 f-stop. Tim Montoani explains.
When I'm shooting outside, I have a pretty simple formula that I go by. I take an ambient reading for daylight. If it's sunny, it's 1/16 at the ASA you're shooting at, sunny 16 rule. Then I'm bringing a strobe in, usually a large Chimera box with a Braun head, and raising the power of the strobe anywhere from a half a stop to a stop and a third, stop and a half over what daylight is. That allows the subject to be the brightest thing in the photograph. Underexposing the sky decreases its importance and also saturates its color.
The first Polaroid establishes that the exposure is accurate, but Montoani will change his lens to a shorter 80mm lens and also switch his light source to the opposite side of the camera to light the front of the subject's face. This image reveals to us the underexposed blue sky and clouds that Montoani is creating through exposure in the photograph. Looking now through an 80mm lens, Montoani works quickly to avoid the possibility of the midday sun coming in through the studio door. The camera is moved to create the framing that Montoani likes, and an incident meter reading is taken to check for proper exposure. The aperture is adjusted to an f11 and 2/3, and Montoani is ready to record the image on film.
Here we go. Good, just like that. Nose that way just a touch. Good, eyes right here. Good.
As Montoani shoots, film backs are reloaded and labeled. To create a sense of motion in the photograph, the rear wheel of Nothstein's bike is spun before several of the images are captured. With a shutter speed and a flash duration of 1/125th of a second, a slight blur in the spokes is apparent in the photographs. A look at the image also illustrates how the strobe can be used to expose your subject at a level of illumination that allows the photographer to manipulate the brightness of the sky. In this image, the strobe was turned off and only the blue sky and the subject's silhouette were recorded at a 1/25th at f16. This second image was shot at f11, with the strobe adjusted to produce a subject meter reading of f11 also. We can see that shooting at f11 produces a brighter, less saturated blue sky. The final image was recorded at f16, with the strobe output set to match the f16 exposure. By boosting the output of the strobe, Montoani was able to produce an accurate exposure of the subject and create a slightly underexposed, saturated blue sky. Returning to the studio, Montoani now has Marty Nothstein sitting with his bike on the platform. The light bank is set close to the subject area, and a meter reading is taken to check the output of the strobe. The lens aperture is set at f16, and using a 50mm lens, Montoani begins to work with his subject to create an interesting composition. A Polaroid is shot, and Montoani then begins to put the image on film.
Okay, good, here we go. Nose that way just a touch.
With still one more setup ahead, Montoani works quickly to create some variations on the blue sky theme.
Nose that way.
The results of Tim's hard work pay off. Working with only a single light source and the blue sky, Montoani again created several unique images of his subject and his profession. With little time remaining, the studio doors were closed and Montoani crafted an entirely different type of portrait. Tim Montoani comments on his film selection.
I'll typically shoot a VPS or a negative stock film, transparency film, and black and white. I'm working in a situation where I don't necessarily know what the client's going to do. For me personally, these athletes are the best in the world, and for me to document it on every format I can, every type of film I can, that allows me longevity for personal use and also my client, whether it's going to go to a newsprint in black and white, whether it's going to go to a magazine, or whether they want to make photographic reproductions to hang in their offices.
The studio is dark, and Montoani places the large light bank on the floor to light Marty Nothstein. Behind Nothstein, a 750-watt tungsten light is set up on the base of a stand to light the red paper background. As with the Leha portrait, an incident meter reading was used to determine a background exposure for the image. For this shot, Montoani requests an 81B warming filter to warm the skin tones in the image. Depending upon the skin tone, Tim usually shoots with a warming filter ranging from 81A to 81D. To insert the filter, the bellows is pulled back and the filter is placed behind the lens on the front standard of the camera. With the filter in place and the focus and framing set, Montoani prepares to make the first Polaroid of the image.
Okay, here we go. Okay, there's going to be a flash, and then I'm going to expose for the background. You're going to be holding still.
The modeling light is turned off, and Montoani shakes the camera during the 2-second background exposure.
Okay, relax for a sec.
The exposure for the image is good, but Montoani wants to reduce the light striking the subject's white shirt. A large black flag is placed along the bottom edge of the light bank to slightly reduce the underlighting. With the lighting set, Montoani checks the focus with a loupe and then records the image on film. The aperture is f11, and again Tim shakes the camera during the 2-second background exposure.
And 3.
The result of this combined strobe and tungsten image is a dramatic yet fairly conservative portrait of Marty Nothstein. The results of Tim's next idea are stunning. By turning the bike upside down and spinning the wheel in front of the subject's face, the spokes on the wheel are slightly blurred. Montoani records the image a number of times on film, working at a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second at f/22. For this image, the tungsten background light was turned off.
Good.
The final image of Nothstein is a striking example of how simple photographic techniques can be used to create unique and powerful images for your clients. One of the tools that Tim Montoani uses when working in large format is the Broncolor probe metering system. To use this optical metering system, the probe is inserted into the film plane area and the camera back is locked. The photographer then looks at the image and can actually pinpoint areas to be metered right off of the film plane by using the small hole at the end of the probe as a sight. A switch at the opposite end of the probe controls when meter readings are taken. The accompanying handheld meter enables the photographer to exactly calculate the exposure latitude of the image. The lens should be stopped down and the viewing shade should be attached when metering. One other feature of the system is the built-in infrared sensor that gives you complete control of the power packs at a touch of a button. The advantage of this highly accurate reflective metering system is that it reads the amount of light traveling through the lens and striking the film plane. This film plane meter reading accounts for any light loss due to either bellows extension or filtration at the lens. It is common practice with this metering system to place an 18% gray card into the scene to determine a precise exposure reading. The probe reflective metering system, which calculates an exposure for 18% gray, will give a meter reading of 0 when the gray card is properly exposed. In this case, to save time, the probe was positioned to read an area on Marty's forehead. Because the value of Caucasian skin is approximately 36%, one stop above 18%, the meter reading was taken and the strobe power was adjusted until a +1 value was achieved. To ensure that Marty's white jersey did not get overexposed, a meter reading of his shoulder was taken, and the black flag on the light bank was adjusted until the shirt read a value of +2 with the probe meter. A +2 value is white with detail or a 72% value. Marketing your skills is one of the most important aspects of the photographic business. Tim Montoani uses several techniques, like these monthly mailers or other printed pieces, to make the biggest impact he can on a consistent basis. Tim has found that it is often the presentation of the image that can make the biggest impact on a prospective client. Today, computers and digitized images are also providing a way to show your portfolio. Dean Collins explains.
Digitized images are something photographers are more involved with than ever before. Anywhere from pre-press opportunities, working with designers, their own marketing materials, and even electronic portfolios that are being sent out are being done in a digitized fashion. The way we've been digitizing our images are on Kodak Photo CD. It's a very fast and safe way to scan the images, and it's a very good method for archival storage.
Digitizing images allows a photographer to store and manipulate imagery and send out samples of work on a CD or a computer disc. In Tim Montoani's electronic portfolio, the images can be individually selected and viewed, or all of the images can be viewed as if it were a slideshow. The disc even provides an updated bio on Tim and his latest work.
I've worked with Glenn several times and had the opportunity to take several portraits of him. With his personality, obviously, his hair, he's an extreme skier, you can really push the limits of the kind of portraits that you want to take. This kind of work that I did with Glenn, really pushing conceptually and visually, the photographs I was taking rolled over into the other kind of work I was doing with more conservative personalities, and I found that I was getting some really interesting shots. One of the first things I'll do when a client comes in is I'll ask them, how is this image going to be reproduced? I need to know what the application is. Is it going to go to newsprint? Is it going to go on a sheet-fed press, web press? Is it going to be a billboard? Is it going to be a photographic reproduction? One thing as a commercial photographer, I don't sell slides. I'm not selling a transparency to somebody. So when I build a transparency, I build it for reproduction. You would look at my transparencies possibly and go, hey, this looks kind of flat. But I know that the slide, when it's reproduced, is going to look super. And I'm going to shoot a different contrast range transparency for my portfolio. One that goes to reproduction within the 4-stop range, one which has an extended range that goes in my book that when it's put on a light box looks great and colorful for art directors.
The concept of 4-stop photography can be best explained by this graphic. The range or latitude seen by the human eye for a particular scene or image from black with detail to white with detail is approximately 12 f-stops. The camera lens is capable of recording or compressing 9 f-stops of light, and for film the average range is approximately 7 stops. Photographic paper has only a range of 5 f-stops, and the printing press has a small latitude of approximately 4 stops from black to white. Therefore, it is extremely important to know what medium your images will be used in, so you can craft the transparency or negative to fit the range of the final printed image. For this image of skier Glenn Plake, Montoani used his knowledge of lighting and exposure to ensure the final printed image would be a success. Before the shoot begins, Montoani meets with the art director to discuss the idea for this photograph, which is for Ice USA ski poles. Skier Glenn Plake has just arrived for the shoot, and he must now begin the unique process of creating the hairstyle for which he is known. The shoot begins, and Montoani moves the large camera light bank in close to the subject, with the light bank set in the vertical position. Montoani then moves to the camera to view the image. For this photograph, Tim will use a 4x5 camera with a 90mm wide-angle lens. Opposite the light bank, a Lightform P22 frame with white reflective fabric is set as a reflector fill source. An incident meter reading was taken to establish the subject exposure. The camera is loaded and the first Polaroid is captured.
Okay, relax.
The image is shared with Plake, and some minor adjustments are made to the setup. An overhead view reveals the set and how Montoani places both the light bank and the reflector panel as close as possible to the subject. To ensure the proper position of the ski poles in the photograph, an adjustable arm and super clamp are attached to the base of a grip stand. The clamp is set to hold the ski pole in place. A second magic arm and super clamp are added to the stand and used to hold the second ski pole in position. Film holders have been preloaded with 4x5 color transparency and black and white film. The reflective panel is moved in even closer to the subject to help produce a white highlight in the subject's reflective ski glasses. More Polaroids are taken.
And that lens, 1, 2, and 3. Good.
The images are scrutinized by both the photographer and the client. It is that there are unwanted reflections in the mirrored sunglasses worn by Plake. A black fabric is then used to cover the light stand that sits between Plake's feet. The use of the black fabric eliminates the problem that was visible in the glasses. A final check is made, and Montoani then begins to put the images on film.
1, 2, and good. How about one of those like...
The photograph is a success. Once again, Montoani uses only a single light source to produce an effective ad for the client and a memorable image. The use of the large diffuse sources was critical to this image. The shape and texture of the highly reflective ski poles and the glasses were made visible through the use of these large sources. The glow of light behind the subject is simply the wide-angle view of the light fall-off from the main light source on the background wall. Another tool that Montoani uses to produce extreme wide-angle images on 4x5 is a lens system that is now termed the Hasselblad, the use of a Hasselblad lens on a 4x5 camera. Developed by Dean Collins, the original Hasselblad lens board was created by gluing the rim of a Hasselblad rear lens cap into a lens board. Cinar liked the idea so much, they now offer their own manufactured version of this Hasselblad lens board. To use the Hasselblad, simply mount the Hasselblad lens onto the lens board and attach the lens to the camera as normal. The only difference in using this system is that the lens must be manually stopped down before each exposure. This is accomplished by using the lens depth of field preview button. Using the wide-angle lens on a 4x5 camera allows the photographer to capture the entire image circle produced by the lens. Another advantage to the Hasselblad system is that you can also add perspective and focus control to your images. It's important to note that the Hasselblad lenses will not cover the entire film area on the 4x5, so the image can be cropped if needed. Tim Montoani adds some closing comments.
I've built my photography business off of referrals. When people come into my studio, both families to get their portraits taken or clients for an advertising campaign, it's important that in a short period of time I build a rapport with them, that they feel comfortable in my studio with the people that I work with, so that when they leave, the whole experience was pleasurable. They got good pictures, they had a good time, and I want them to pick up the Polaroids and walk out the door with them and say, "Can I have these? This is the best picture that's ever been taken of me." Prior to going out of the studio, I don't want to say going out of the studio. One of the most important things I learned working with Dean Collins is that there's a roach coach in town. Okay, so we need to get those points across. At the main source, and evenly make sure that you didn't say the right thing.
For more information on other educational products produced by Dean Collins, write or fax Image Data, 7515 Metropolitan Drive, Suite 403, San Diego, California, 92108.